everybody? Are we ready to go? Is this good? It's a little high for me. I'm gonna bring this down a little. I'm not quite as tall. There we go. Welcome, I am Kristen Simmons, and I am so excited to have everybody here to talk to our wonderful authors today. I don't know if you know them, Brandon and Veronica. Yay! They are so kind to be with us here at C2E2, and you know, since I think everybody knows them and knows their books, I was thinking that I would skip the formal bios and head straight into the meat of this. I'm gonna ask a few questions, and then I'm gonna open it up to questions for you. So if you are interested in asking a question, think it through, and at the time that we switch to that, I'll have you come down the middle, line up, and ask your question in the microphone in the center of the room. Sound good? Yes, we know the drill now. We know how it works. We're experts. Okay, to get things started, like I said, since we know who these folks are, and this is a world building panel, could each of you give us 3 world building components, kind of your basic world building components that you would want everybody to know?
Oh gosh, I don't know if can we go like one at a time?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I think the first one that comes to mind is language. And the reason that comes to mind is because then you can name all of your things and people. And I find language really fascinating. I haven't had to develop many languages for books because a lot of my books have been set in the real world, but in the destroyed future, specifically destroyed Chicago. Love to destroy Chicago.
It's a lot of fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know why.
And Chicagoans seem to like it, so I don't know. But when I have had to develop languages, the world of conlang is a very interesting one. And if you are interested in developing constructed languages, you could read The Art of Language Invention by David Peterson. It's really helpful. But yeah, I think it informs a lot of world building.
A lot of my early documents, there's just names are the lead or things in all caps until I start to get a feel for that. Do you do the thing like where you name someone and then halfway through you're like, no, that was awful?
All the time.
Yeah.
I think I just changed every character name in the thing I'm working on now, but yeah.
When I was really early in my career, I didn't really understand search and replace. And I searched and replaced for a name that was in the middle of a common word.
Oh, no.
And didn't realize I'd done it. And then I started reading my document again and I'm like, oh wait, I just messed everything up. So.
Yeah, I've actually done that before. So. It's comforting to know that you have also.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, I remember swapping also Duke and Earl. I'm like, no, he should be an Earl. But then Earl is, I switched Earl for Duke. But Earl is in a lot of words. And that one, yeah. I'd say my first principle is actually backed up a little bit from actual individual things like language. For me, my first principle is to remember that my world building is in service of a story, right? This doesn't have to be for everybody. Tolkien's story was in service of world building, and his story turned out fantastic. So you don't have to do it that way. But for me, I look at it and say there's just so many things I could do. I could work on the economics. I could work on the language. I could work on the geography. I could work on the religion. I could work on so many different things that it's overwhelming. And so when I sit down to build a world, I say, all right, what's going to be important to the characters? What's going to be important to the narrative? And I'm going to let my world building be in service of that, so that I don't end up in the dreaded, encyclopedia entry in the beginning, middle of the chapter, where it's like, I world built this, you're gonna learn about it, darn it, right?
Yes, I think about that a lot also. I think of it as a soup. So this is the best explanation I've come up with for how to world build in a way that feels meaningful for character and story, which is that when you make one decision to start, and then you allow that to inform the other things in the soup, like character and plot. So I make a decision like, okay, the world is going to be a big egg. I don't know. The surface will be, and then it's like, well, what kind of character is the most interesting one to walk on that egg? This is such a weird thing that I chose for an example.
I love it.
And I can't
Stay with it. It's great.
Yeah,
it's
I'm
cool.
going to stick with it, and he has to walk very carefully, so it's, it's precarious. And then that will inform the plot. Like, well, inevitably he'll have to break through the shell of the egg. So
it's a really good metaphor, the soup metaphor. It really is. Like, you start adding things, you want to add things that complement it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you
really
want
smart.
You want the story to lead your character through the most interesting parts of the world. Because if you have all this interesting stuff off to the side, like the Bene Gesserit in Dune.
Sorry, Reverend Mother.
I know, thank you very much for being here, we're honored. I want to know more about them. Like if you touch on something super interesting, I want to go there. So.
In college, I had a friend who had a name for that. The thing that will shows up in stories sometimes and distracts the reader so they can't pay attention to everything else. He called it the gorilla in a phone booth. Because if you have a story where a character's like having a problem with their relationship, is on the phone like arguing with their significant other, and then the narrative says, oh, and then there was a gorilla in the phone booth, and then keeps going, every reader is checked out of the relationship. They're like, wait a minute, a what? So,
like you can't just say that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're number 2?
My number 2. Now I'm off in the soup. I think the soup was my number 2. Can we count it?
Yeah, we can count that.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
My number 2 is that. I wrote it down. What is my number 2? You're gonna see behind the scenes. I thought of it. It was really working, and then I forgot it, and so I wrote it down. Treat my world building like a character. I like world building that has conflict to it. Whenever I build a character, I'm trying to build into the character some sort of conflict. Internal, external, whatever it is, something that's gonna drive the story and make the stakes rise and more tension. And when I approach world building, I kind of approach it the same way. I say, all right, in this setting, what is the inherent conflict? What is the inherent physical, external conflict? What is the inherent sort of conflict that the social setting is going to cause inside of people? I mean, you're kind of an expert on the outsider and what society and the conflict that is placed upon them. Like, that's the sort of thing I'm looking for when I build a world. Because world building isn't just like, what do the mountains look like? It's like, how do people treat the people who don't fit into the boxes, and how does that inspire interesting conflict? I'm always looking, stories are those intersection points between different motivations and different expectations of people.
I like that, yeah. How do they treat the outsider is a good question to know the answer to. And sort of related, I think my third one is systems. So my kind of theory of world building is that worlds are comprised of like a set of systems. So what I mean by that is governments, religions, educational institutions. Sometimes worlds have weak systems, but that says something about the world that you're occupying. So like if you're in a post-apocalyptic world where the systems have broken apart and it's become more chaotic, that says something about the world that you're in. And some have strong systems, like I would argue, most dystopian novels have a really strong system at the core of them, which is usually like, the oppressive government. And so you can start to, when I start to build a world, I love a strong system, and like the ways that people find to maneuver around them. So I'm always trying to develop at least one, or placing some in conflict with each other, and figuring out their rules and the kind of order that they've tried to impose on society, and then the ways in which that order breaks down. So
that's a really interesting way of saying it. I like that. Often when I'm kind of teaching world building, I'm looking for that word, systems, that you just put, because not every book needs to talk about the government. Not every book needs to talk about gender roles. Not every book needs to talk about religion, but every book's going to talk about something like that, a system, as you put it, and kind of like how people move through those systems. That's a very useful tool to think about. Mm-hmm. Oh, my third. I have to go now. All right, those who are familiar with my lectures will be able to guess my third. A lot of times, like, I love world building, so I sometimes kind of get into the weeds in the world building before a book starts, and that's why I keep in mind this idea of I want a world building service of story. I don't want encyclopedia entries, I want conflict. But at the end of the day, there is one guiding principle I follow, which is always err on the side of what's awesome. And it's kind of become a motto for my company. It's like, at the end of the day, if you got into this story because you wanted write about people in giant plate mail that's basically power armor, then remember why you started writing this story. Even if all these social systems and dealing with mental health and stuff is really vital, don't forget the awesome. And that's just kind of a little bit of a guiding light to me. Make sure it's still fun.
Yeah, I listened to a talk that was by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. It's on like the Romantic something Writers Association website. Anyway, you can find it if you look for Writing the Id. But it's basically about that, just put it in a slightly different way. She is a researcher on neuroscience. Guys, don't quote me on that. She does something with brains. And she's learned that one of the reasons that people are so drawn to story is that it kind of like stimulates the pleasure center of the brain in certain ways. So people really love they love conflict, they love romance, they love beauty, they love, like these sets of categories. And she advocates for just finding ways to make a story feel enjoyable by including things that you love, which sounds really obvious, but when you get farther into your writing career or your writing, growth, you can get so analytical that you forget to just what makes you love things. You have to include those things. You can't make the story all make sense, perfect logical sense. I mean, I guess you can try that, but it's not going to be what makes people love your work and what makes you love it while you're writing it. So.
Yeah, I have sometimes arguments with my editorial team, pleasant arguments, right? Where they're pushing for everything that everyone does to always make perfect sense.
Yeah.
My editorial director, he's, that's one of his things, this doesn't make sense. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's because the person's memory is flawed. And they're repeating it back the same way that I have done and then being caught in it. Things are messy when human beings are involved, and the way that they appreciate things doesn't always fit in these boxes. And so even for the characters, I think that applies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and in any world that you occupy, there are going to be things that feel incongruous or strange. That's how worlds are. So it can't all make sense.
Our world doesn't make sense.
No,
so if the fantasy world makes sense, it's not going to have verisimilitude.
Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
Love that. I love that. Okay, moving on. I recently saw a post that Veronica did on her Instagram, which I loved so much. She's like, what was it? Where she pitches each of her books in different ways. She pitches one of her books in different ways to different groups of people. And so since we're at C2E2, I was hoping that each of you could pitch your most recent book to a Comic-Con audience.
I'm gonna make you go first.
Okay, only fair. All right, so my most recent book, it's the last of a series. So the pitch is not I'm gonna
maybe
change
you could do the first
question.
of the series.
Yeah, right, because the pitch is, hey, have you read the first 3? Good, you'll like this one. Have you not? Don't buy it.
You're already in at this point.
Yeah. So I'm gonna pitch. I really like that you did this, by the way. This is a really useful thing for authors to learn, is how to pitch to different audiences. Back when I had to hand sell Mistborn, I had 3 different pitches. These days I don't have to have as many pitches. I'm not hand selling anymore, but I had to learn. And so I'm gonna, just for illustrative purposes, I'm actually gonna pick Mistborn. It's an old book, but it's the one that I have 2 different pitches I can do for. Because it really is cool to be able to learn to do this. And so Mistborn, I would kind of talk to the person and say, what are you looking for? What do you like? Or I'd kind of be like, does this feel like someone who wants me to lead with plot or with character? I rarely lead with world, even though we're on a world building panel. That's because, again, what the story happens to is, the people it happens to is really important. So I would pitch Mistborn one of 2 ways. I would say, that story about the young hero who's gone on a quest to save the world and things like that? That happened here, but he failed. He died, the world is awful, and the Dark One won. It's 1,000 years later. This is a story of a gang of thieves who get together and say, all right, the prophecies were lies, a hero, didn't work out. Let's do this our way. Let's rob the Dark Lord silly, bribe his armies away from him, overthrow the Empire, and escape with all the rest of the money and be fantastic, wealthy, and have done something good. So it's a heist. It's Ocean's 11 meets Lord of the Rings, right? It's Sauron 1.
It's a great pitch.
So yeah, that pitch lands really well. But I can also pitch it a completely different way for those who have read the book and be like, but that leaves out the characters. I can say, this is the story of a young woman who is recruited by a gang of thieves because she has a magical talent she doesn't know about. They are planning the biggest heist ever. They're gonna rob the Dark Lord. They need her to learn to imitate a noblewoman, to be their mole among them, and at night she's gonna be a magical ninja. So it's basically My Fair Lady with ninja school. Right? And those are two different pitches that hit kind of just a different emotion. And it's a lot of fun to be thinking about that for your books, those of you who are writers, like how would I pitch this in different ways based on how the situation comes up?
Well, I should have gone first. I'm not as good at this as you are, but I'll do my best while I have the copy of it. So this is my new book. It comes out in a couple weeks. Thanks. It's called When Among Crows. It is set in Chicago. And this time, there is an underworld of creatures. They are based on creatures from Slavic folklore, as Chicago is Polish, and so am I. So the quick pitch for it is that it's The Wizard of Oz meets The Witcher. The Witcher being the, monsters part, and The Wizard of Oz being the all-in-one, the group of people who come together for a common goal of finding the wizard, which in this case is Baba Yaga, who lives above a Harold's Chicken in Chicago, which is... this is a joke I really like because the legends of Baba Yaga have her on a house that stands on chicken legs. So in this case, we've got Harold's Chicken. And it's about a young man named, or not a young man, he's not that young. I'm just used to saying that because of writing YA, sorry. He's a man, he's a little mysterious, his name is Demeter, and he comes to a mysterious woman, Allah, with a deal, which is that he will help cure the curse that's killing her if she helps him find Baba Yaga. And there's a problem, which is that he is part of a holy order of monster hunters, and she is a monster. So she is a Zmora, which is a nightmare creature from folklore. I think it's in a couple types of folklore, but anyway, it's like a creature that it's supposed to be like perching on your chest at night and giving you nightmares, and then also like sucking your life force. In this case, she just eats fear. That's what they do. Anyway, so she doesn't know who he really is or what he really wants, and they go on a little bit of like an all-in-one day friendship-forming quest together, except, the secrets are a big deal. So that is When Among Crows.
You said you were bad at this.
Well, thanks.
That was pretty good. All right. Both of you have been in this game for a little while now. Can you talk about how sci-fi and fantasy have changed over the years?
Well, one thing that has changed is that people from all walks of life around me, like my sister's jock, broy boss, will be like, have you read this Mistborn series? And I'll be like, don't talk to me about Mistborn, John. So that has changed. Have you observed anything else?
So I think fantasy in particular has kind of expanded its scope of what is defined as fantasy in some very good and interesting ways. When I was growing up, there were other kind of types of fantasy, but the Tolkien-esque quest fantasy was the fantasy. If you looked at the bestseller list, which when I was growing up, not many of them hit, there were a few that would hit the bestseller list, and they all were basically, Tolkien died, so I guess we better keep doing it without him, right? And some of these stories are very good. I grew up on on The Wheel of Time, right? Which is a very Tolkien inspired, particularly for the first 3 books. Fantasy right around the mid-90s turned into a lot more political intrigue, and that is George's fault for writing another kind of foundational work that changed a lot of the ways. But then as we progressed, Harry Potter changed the landscape a lot for fantasy. And you're still seeing Dark Academia, I think, is an echo of that. The dystopian, worked its way into fantasy in some really cool ways. I mean, Scott Westerveld was before with some of his fantasy, not uglies, but Leviathan, which is fantastic.
Well, I'd argue that most of the YA dystopia that was popular, around the time of the Hunger Games is more fantasy than sci-fi.
It is. It really is. Yeah. And so basically and then you start getting some fantasy that is not based on medieval Europe, which is really adding and expanding and telling us fantasy can be something else. They were always there, but now they are being bestsellers. And basically what fantasy has become so much broader in all the best ways. And I find that really exciting.
Yeah, a great example of this is if you guys have read Gideon the Ninth. I mean, what is that book? It's amazing, but it's necromancers in space, and it's hilarious, and it's one of the weirdest things I've ever read, and I was so happy about it. But I think you're right. Yes, the definitions have expanded, and the kinds of things that the average person is willing to read has definitely grown, which is awesome. And I love things like romantasy, for example, because they just pull people in, and they're come for the sexiness, stay for the dragons, and also we have other dragons to show you. So anything that gets people in bookstores and interested in books, I am really pumped about.
Yeah, I think the romantasy trend's been awesome for the genre. Just more people enjoying dragons is good for everyone.
Yeah, agreed.
I think that should have been the title of this panel today, actually. That's a good one. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about our world building soup, but a lot of people in our other lives find it difficult to talk about polarizing topics like religion, like politics, but these things are parts of our lives more than ever now. Fiction has always given us a place to have the tough conversations. Fiction is the lens in which we view reality, right? So have any current events inspired any of your writing, and how?
No, you open your mouth first.
It's my turn first on this one.
I'm just making you go first the rest of the time.
So yes, obviously, right? Writers write because of the things we experience in the world. This is part of the reason that we tell stories. I mean, and I love fantasy because oftentimes I tell my students, one of the things that I want you to learn to do as a writer is stop being a cook and start being a chef. That definition for me is that a cook knows how to follow a recipe, a chef knows why, right? And I want you to know the why. And when you learn how to do that, you can start breaking things down and saying, all right, what makes a good story? What about my life can I build into a story in an organic way and actually have the effect I want to? And I love fantasy because there are things you can do with fantasy that approach topics in a way that is able to get away from some of the baggage that we bring to it. Not that that baggage is bad. In fact, a lot of fantastic stories are about dealing with that, but fantasy can do it in a different way, right? We can go back to Grandpa Tolkien and we can say, look, there is a story about an elf and a dwarf getting to know each other and becoming best friends. Tolkien abhorred metaphor. He hated it. He's like, my stories are not allegories. But you still have a guy writing during the civil rights movement about people from two very different racial backgrounds becoming best friends and abandoning their preconceived notions of one another, to the point that in the stories, Gimli gets to go to the Grey Havens because he's just such a good friend with Legolas. They travel the world, they see everything, and then they head off to see the Grey Havens because they haven't seen that yet, right? And there's something really powerful about a fantasy novel being able to do that. The story I always tell is that Dragonsbane was my entry. Lesser known, lesser read story. And this is a story about a woman having a midlife crisis. Middle-aged woman having a midlife crisis. I was handed it when I was 14. Normally you'd not pick that book, but guess what? It has dragons, right? Meanwhile, my mother had graduated first in her class in accounting in a year where she was the only woman in most of her accounting classes. And she decided to put off her career and have me, which is not a choice anyone needs to make, but she decided. As a teenage boy, I was always like, well, of course she did. Look at me, I'm awesome, right? But I read Dragon's Bane, and it's about a woman trying to decide how much time to spend on her family and how much time to spend on her magic. She's a really talented magic user. And I'm reading this being like, ditch the family, magic is awesome, go hang with the dragons. And I get done with this book and I'm like, oh wait, this is about my mom. This fantasy book taught me to understand my mother's conflict between her career and her family. How dare you teach me something in my story about slaying dragons? And that's been just like a core part of my understanding of the genre. And when I start writing, the things that are important and powerful to me always end up in there. I never want them to become the thing that's like, this is the meaning. But instead, I'm like, this is what makes people human. And so yes, every character and every story and every aspect of the story has something that I'm dealing with or asking about or exploring as I write those characters. And you could pick any one of them and I could say yes and point out what it was.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when you think about writing science fiction and fantasy, you might think that whole like adage, write what you know, is nonsense because you're like, okay, well, I don't know dragons, so, well, I guess maybe some of us do, but I think there's always a piece of any world building, any character moment, whatever, that has a kind of emotional foundation or some kind of real world corollary, and it's your job as the writer to eventually realize that that's there and to do some research. Because like I'm always writing about characters who have endured violence, right? Like this is a theme in a lot of my books. Have I endured violence? No. But it's important to know, what kind of psychology someone in that situation would exhibit. So always researching, every book, researching PTSD, just every time. And there's always stuff like that. And with any work, you can choose to try to steer around the things that are a little difficult and challenging in your world building. That's like a thing you can decide, or you can decide to steer into it. If you try to steer around it, people might see it anyway. If you try to steer into it, then you have to be humble and kind of humble yourself before that thing. Like in my book, Chosen Ones, which is also set in Chicago. Jeez, guys. But it features a black chosen one. There's like a group of chosen ones, but the guy who's like the chosen one is a black guy. I'm not a black guy. So I needed to do a lot of research. I read a lot of articles about Barack Obama because that felt like a good example of kind of what sort of like a person thrust into the public eye who's got a lot of expectations on them that are different because of their race. And I also brought in a sensitivity reader, which is like something a lot of people hate about writing now, but I love it. So basically what you're bringing in is someone with real world experience, a lived experience that's different from your own, who can comment on the ways that you have like chosen to represent something in your work. They don't usually come in like, you have to do this, but they come in to kind of meaningfully inform your writing and point out the ways that you're not going to know everything because you don't have every perspective of every person who has ever lived. So I make frequent use of sensitivity readers for sure.
I have found that every specialty beta reader I brought in like that has made the book just that much better. When I wrote Trust of the Emerald Sea, I have a deaf character. And I'm like, I'm gonna need some help here. And we went and got a professional that was their job, and man, were they good, right?
Yeah. And you can see it as like somebody picking at your work, but you can also see it as an opportunity to make your work grow and become more complex and much better. So I choose path B, I guess.
Yay. That was great. I want to ask you, since you both have had really significant events in both of your careers, I'm going to start with you, Brandon. Most recently, can you talk about your Kickstarter experience with The Sunlit Man, which, for those of you who don't know, was the most successful Kickstarter of all time.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this did change some things, and it didn't at the same time. One of the big things that it changed is a lot of people who try hard to ignore fantasy and genre fiction in general went, wait, this is actually popular? Like the number of people in Hollywood, like I've always had attention in Hollywood. You know how it is. Like they're always looking to buy something, and particularly if they can get it cheap from an author and just have those rights and maybe develop them. But as soon as they heard that number, they came and they're like, the Brendan, which has been interesting because I'm like, I'm still selling what I've always sold. It's just now you can actually see what it is. It was very validating in that not necessarily to the book sales, right? Again, the books sell basically what they've always sold, but something happened in 2014 that scared me. That was when when Amazon turned off the ability to buy all Macmillan books, which Tor is an imprint of. I believe it was 2014. You know, someone can fact check me on that. But right around then, in February, when they were having contract disputes, Amazon's like, fine, we just won't sell your books anymore. We'll see what you think about that, which wouldn't have been a big deal if Amazon hadn't built itself up to be 75% of the market, where suddenly, like that, they could strangle any corporation building books and any author that they wanted to. And that is when I started building Dragonsteel, not just to be a support arm for me, but to be a genuine company, right? That's when I said, all right, I'm gonna get my own in-house publicity team. I'm gonna get my own in-house editorial art team and fulfillment team. And we're gonna start building books ourselves that are not tied to any one platform or no one out there being able to just turn us off. And the Kickstarter was the culmination of that. You know, writing new books, first run books that were then going to go to New York and to Amazon, but that we were gonna sell first. And having that be successful enough that it could fund my company by itself basically gave us autonomy from any corporation that would decide that they were going to turn off my books, and that was exceptionally validating.
It was really awesome seeing all these publications suddenly have to say fantasy words.
Yeah.
Yes.
Agreed. And Veronica, can you talk a little bit about how your life as an author has been affected by the Divergent movies?
Yeah, so, right, Divergent movies. First one was shot here. We love that.
Chicago.
It was the start of my career, so I don't know what would have happened without it, but I know that it set me up in a particular way, which is that I was able to be a full-time author. I was also able to take a lot of risks in the choices that I made, and maybe not risks so much as just like decide what I wanted to write and write that. There was pressure to write like another dystopian series, or at least like a grounded kind of sci-fi. Grounded is what they call it when it's set in the real world. And I was like, I don't want to do that. So I ended up with this weird, eclectic mixture of books. One of them is a space opera. One is alternate history, contemporary fantasy hybrid. One is a dystopian mystery. One is a post-apocalyptic. And then When Among Crows is urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy. So they're all within the science fiction and fantasy umbrella, but they're a kind of a weird assortment. If I were better at pitching them, like this older gentleman came up to a table that all my books were on the other day, and he's like, so, what do you got here? And if I were really a good salesman, I would have been like, well, there's something for everyone. What do you like to read? I can find the thing of mine that will be the gateway book that will get you hooked on Veronica Roth. If I were a good salesman, I would have said that, but I didn't. I said, some of them are dystopian. But the point is that like the Divergent movies made me capable of doing that. So I could become someone who is focused on growing as a writer and exploring this genre that I love so much and have since I was a child, instead of having to focus on more practical concerns, which is a huge privilege that I now enjoy. And yeah, I got to meet some cool people and see some cool things. And now sometimes Amazon's like, we think you'll like this movie, Divergent.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, I'm like, what gave me away?
They recommend The Wheel of Time to me all the time.
You're like,
Yeah.
you got me.
Yeah.
But doesn't it make you feel good? Because you're like, clearly my algorithm is like representing me
Yep.
as a person.
But then my kids get on my Amazon and they buy other things, and so they're like, and would you also like this rubber chicken that's wearing odd clothing? And I'm like, well, yes, but that doesn't, yeah.
Funny you should ask.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, but then I'm going to take questions from the audience. So if you're thinking of asking a question, now's the time to piece it together and go ahead and start to line up, please. So my last question is, a lot of writers believe that you have a core story inside of you, that you kind of write the same thing over and over in different ways. Sometimes that is a story itself, sometimes that is a certain character attribute, sometimes that is a aspect of your world building. And I was just wondering if either of you, or both of you, have that core story inside yourself that come through in all of your work, or a lot of your work.
I can go first this time.
Awesome.
Okay. I didn't really know what this core story was. I do feel myself returning to some of the same things. I always have eyeball horror because I find getting your eye poked out to be the most horrifying thing. I always have arena fights. I don't know why. I think I just love arena fights. But I had a friend who's an author point out to me, she's like, I think your books are always about duty versus freedom. And I was like, smart, yes, let's go with that.
Or eyeballs.
But the strange thing is that the works for younger readers, and maybe it's because they're for younger readers, or maybe it's because I wrote them first, they're always about reclaiming freedom and sort of stepping away from the obligations of family or society. My latter works, or my grown-up works, I don't like saying adult works because it's kind of not communicating what I want it to be communicating. But my works for older readers are more about obligation and like what your obligation is to, and how to kind of resolve that within yourself. So I don't know if that's because I'm getting older or because the themes are different when you're writing about older characters, but that does seem to be what I keep returning to.
Yeah, the number of times that the word fantasy has become slightly problematic in introductions.
Yeah, I'm a fantasy writer.
Yeah, like I went to a convention once where it was mostly mainstream, but they were branching out, and they said, and now our fantasy man. And I'm like, well, I mean, that's awesome, but...
like, I suppose.
Yeah, but then you also go and you say, yeah, I write YA fantasy and adult fantasy. So, I do think this question is one that's better answered by anyone but the two of us at the table, right? Because the readers and the critics will notice themes and things like that between our works when we won't, oftentimes. But if I have to answer, I guess my answer to mine would be, yes, fantasy, but what if science, right? Like that's kind of a major theme to me is I love the era of the Renaissance into the Industrial Revolution, where people were starting to apply scientific reasoning to everything around them. I remember in reading once like this scientific article on how to dig ditches that was published in the early 1900s. And it's this, back then there was this idea that science could help everyone. And the tone of this paper was, here's how to help ditch diggers to not be having repetitive stress injuries and to dig better ditches and live better lives through science and like vector science and things like this. And it's like science during that era was kind of mysterious and it had this cool aspect to it and this saved the world. And then we started blowing the world up, and some of the perspective on science shifted. And there's some very good science fiction during that era. But I find myself drawn again and again to this idea of what if we take reasoning and we apply it to the world around us, what can we discover? And I find that just really fascinating. And since this is a world building panel, I'll go with that answer.
I love it. I love it. That's great. Okay, we're going to start with audience questions. Go right ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of chefs that make soup, I'm Rag, I make soup.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
character from the Stormlight Archive. Yes.
My question is around the outline. When you are building a new world or writing a new series, how much time do you actually spend making the entire outline, or do you build it as you go along your writing journey?
For me, it's both, right? I budget time for outlining at the beginning and world building and all of these things because it's a budget that is like a limited budget. When I hit the end of it, I have to start working because otherwise I will get world builder's disease and I will spend time writing encyclopedia entries. I usually budget for all of the pre-writing. I try to do about 10,000 words per 100,000 words of finished material that I'm expecting. So a 10,000 word outline for your average book, which is about a week to 2 weeks of work. For a big thing like the Stormlight Archive, we're looking more in several months. And if it's a series, it's going to take a little more up front. But this is always changing as I write. Particularly the first book, I'm like, that idea was crap. That does not play out at all. Scrap that. Let's throw something else in there. Try it for a few chapters. If that doesn't work, I'll scrap that. Finally, I'll find the thing that works. And that's why my second draft often is knocking out walls and still rebuilding things because I will change something in chapter 36 that makes chapter 2 just make no sense anymore.
Yeah, we have like a paradigm when we talk about writing, which is you're a pantser, you write by the seat of your pants, or you're a like a plotter, whatever, you make outlines. I'm like, I'm over here making plans, but I am like a sloppy outliner. So I only spend as much time as I have to, because I know that while I'm writing, I'll stop like at 3 or 4 times in the middle of a rough draft to re-outline based on like what I've learned by exploring the way that the scenes actually feel. Because sometimes what I think will work doesn't really feel right. And then when I'm done with the rough draft, I write an outline of what I had, and then I re-outline a revision plan. So that's like, I think we're at 5 outlines at this point. So I'm just like, always be outlining is what I'm doing. But that's how I kind of balance wanting to be someone who discovers things along the way with someone who really needs a roadmap. So I think the outline is like extremely flexible and very messy.
Yeah.
I think that's a really smart way to approach it. The more I learn about writing and talk to writers, the more people are never one or the other, despite that being a nice paradigm to talk about.
Yeah.
Everyone's in the middle using both tools because we're writers, we'll use any tool we can to get a cool story out of it.
Yeah, we're all just desperate to finish. That's our main thing in common.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Richard, and I wrote down this question because otherwise I was not going to phrase it well, so forgive me. Basically, I know all of us here, I don't want to call us all nerds, but I consider myself a nerd. We read a lot of series, we watch TV, we play video games, we see all sorts of different media. How do you think about other stories, and do you have any worries or concerns about incorporating other people's ideas into your own work and kind of your own history?
So are you asking about like whether we're concerned about like accidentally copying things, or is that?
Right, and it's also kind of like that, but also we know that like seeing other people's stuff can inspire us to like move in a way we've never thought before. So it's like, how do you straddle that thin line?
I don't worry about it so much. I think it's a little bit like everything's been done already is the feeling that I sometimes have. However, I think it's important to be aware of what came before you, like what context you're entering into. So, for example, like, we all know 1984, right? Like big dystopian novel, deals with mass surveillance. I wrote Poster Girl, which is a dystopian mystery that has an element of mass surveillance in it, but it only exists because of 1984. So I can explore different things because 1984 exists. And so I'm not worried about like people saying, well, 1984 did it first, because like, first of all, so many people have done stories about mass surveillance, right? We live in a world with mass surveillance, so it's gonna happen. But I just want to know, what's already been said in this conversation, and like, what is the meaningful thing that I would like to add to it? So I don't fret about it, because I think like anything that you do, you put it through the filter of your brain, it's going to come out different, usually, and if not, that's what beta readers are for. But I do I think it's good to be aware and knowledgeable about like the space that you're stepping into.
Yeah, I agree. I used to worry about this a ton as a new writer, and I think it is a thing as a new writer that we do worry about, and it is a bigger danger when you are a new writer. But the more you become the chef instead of the cook, the more you're able to identify what about this thing excited you and incorporate it. I think it's really important to be well-read in the genre, and so you have to learn to balance this, right? If you just stop reading entirely, then you'll ossify into something that is not moving as the genre grows. And so it is a necessary sort of thing to learn to do. I would recommend at some point, there are some stories that your influences are such a jumble that it's very hard to pick out where things were. Some of them, it's like, I mentioned Tress earlier. My wife and I watched The Princess Bride. My wife said, "Man, that's a good movie. I wish the princess did something." I mean, that's part of the joke of the movie, so it's like incorporated. But she's like, "Man, if I had been in that position and the man I love vanished at sea, I'd go find him." And so I'm like, "Ooh, that's a story." And so it very obviously said this was inspired by The Princess Bride. The question is, then you go out and find him. And that story. So you can have a story that's deeply influenced by something, and it doesn't compromise the integrity of the art, though it is usually good to be like aware of it yourself and not try to hide it. Just be like, this is where it came from. Let's see where art builds upon art, and let's see where it goes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody talking more in front of me. I kind of have two. The first one is, would you recommend any independent publishing, self-publishing? Do you have any advice for self-publishing?
I can say I think the wise author breaking in right now would explore both options, traditional and indie publishing, and they're both very viable still. Which means that there are more options for authors than there ever have been before, which makes it a good time to be publishing. It's also a bad time because there are so many more options. There are so many more things out there, so it is harder to make a mark than it used to be. But yes, I would talk to the people, like I would not talk to me, because on one hand, I'm the most successful indie author of all time. Following my Kickstarter. On the other hand, I didn't do that by being indie. You want to go talk to the people who are in the trenches, who are doing 20 books to 50K, or who are hanging out on the forums that are talking about what's working right now. I find that in general, the romance authors really are sharp and smart about this. So if you can get to a romance author convention, they know the business better than anybody. And listen to them, not to me, because my experience is deeply skewed. But I do think it is something that you should be exploring if you're trying to break in. It's not good for everyone, but it is good for a lot of people.
Yeah, just to add to that, I obviously don't have experience with indie publishing, but I think it's important to know your own strengths. So indie publishing rewards people who are willing to put in a lot of work in a lot of different areas and do it all by themselves. So they're good marketers, they're good publicists, they're good writers, they're good at everything. And if you feel like maybe that's not what your skill set is, then it might not be for you. And also it rewards output. So if you're really if you really struggle to put things into the world quickly, then it might not be a good fit either. But those are just the things I've observed.
That's a really good point. To be successful in indie these days, you need to be doing multiple books a year, is what everybody tells me. It also doesn't work for some subgenres. Picture books just don't sell. Indie, middle grade, really tough sell in indie. YA can sell in indie, but what sells the best is kind of adult serial fiction. So detective fiction, romances where they're a larger kind of sideways series where each book is about a different character who's introduced in the first book, and things like that. These are what are really doing the best.
I'm just debating whether my second question is actually good or not.
All right, thanks for the question.
We have time for about 2 more questions. I'm sorry that I know there's a huge line, but these authors will be available in a little while in a signing.
Oh yeah, you can ask a question in a signing line. I know people feel like they're not allowed to, but you can.
Definitely feel like you can talk to them in that form as well.
Yeah.
You have to have a ticket for my signing lines, though,
Yeah.
and they're all
Not mine.
out. So you can try to beg them to stick you in the lightning signing. I got through my lightning signing 10 minutes early last night, which means that you might be able to beg my team to sneak you in at the end if there's extra time.
Hi, my name is Jasenia. This is a question for both of you. So when you create your worlds, you obviously create rules. Rules from anything from your government to society and magic, and inevitably I feel like the main character will break that rule or somehow subvert it in some kind of way. Something that was like we previously thought, oh, this can't be done, and then like, wow, all of a sudden now it's done. So how do you decide like what is the appropriate amount of breaking is, so that like the reader also is like, oh, like they buy into it, and then they're just like, you're just doing that just to make it interesting. So how do you decide, I guess, an appropriate amount?
Fantastic question.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer? Do you want to go? Okay.
I do.
So I have a rule of thumb for myself called Sanderson's first law. And I've got 3 laws of magic. They are not like Asimov's law. These are rules that I try to follow. And Sanderson's first law is about foreshadowing, right? Your ability to solve problems with magic in your books is directly proportional to how well the reader understands that magic. So breaking is the same thing as this. Your ability to break your magic system in a satisfying way. You can break things in an unsatisfying way, and sometimes you want to do that. But in a satisfying way, the way you break it is by letting the reader understand the magic and understand the holes in it. So when the break happens, they say one of 2 things. They say, that was foreshadowed and I saw this coming. Or they say, wow, this story demanded that happen all along and I didn't see it till now, you wily fox Sanderson, right? And those are 2 different emotions that you're looking for. But if you do it right, it'll be one of those 2 emotions instead of, oh, of course you had to get them out of a corner, right? And so it's all about setting it up ahead of time so that it makes sense. And that's the same rule secretly for all storytelling, right? If you're writing a romance and it's about 2 characters getting together, you can break the rule that they hate each other in a way that at the end people will be like, oh yeah, they just made them get together. Or you can have them get together and be like, I was waiting for this, I knew it was going to happen to them. Or you can be like, those 2, that's perfect. How did I not see that? You wily fox Sanderson, right? This is all about foreshadowing and controlling the reader's perception.
Yeah, I think, that pretty much sums it up, but I think you have to create a little pathway. You can refer to someone breaking the rule in the past. You can create a kind of like strangeness in your magic. I don't really write about magic that often, but I did in this book, and I can't tell you about it because you haven't read it yet, so I'm trying to figure out how to explain it. But it's like maybe this rule was broken, or this rule has an exception that already exists in a slightly different way, so that like the thing that you did feels like it's of a similar kind to the thing that was an exception before. Basically, I feel like don't break the rules. Make the rules a little bit more flexible. That maybe isn't, I don't know if I mean that yet. I just tried it out just now. So anyway, create a pathway. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's do one more.
Hello, I'm Andy. I've got a question for both. So we've talked a lot about like world building, all the different elements when it comes to like currency, language, politics, religion. When you're building a world, is there an appropriate time to yada yada something, or is that something to avoid a time?
I love this question.
I feel like there has to be an appropriate time to yada yada, because I can't explain all that stuff. And I'll give you an example, which is that when they were adapting the Divergent movie, I think it was Neil Berger, who was the director of the first one, called me to ask me this question. And he was like, how do they do plumbing? And I was like, Neil, bless you, I don't know. And I had someone else ask me about, like, what do they do when they get their period? And I was like, also don't know that. I mean, that would be good to know. And there are some like dystopian books that actually really engage with that question, which I think is awesome. But I was like, you can't answer everything. I don't know, maybe you can. Someone is more detailed at world building than I am, and it is Brandon. But I think you gotta, like, there's gonna be, just like they say, sometimes there's like, people say there's 3-dimensional characters and there's some 2-dimensional characters. Like, you can't explore every single person. I feel like it's that way with world building sometimes. It's like, I'm gonna explore the train system here, but I'm maybe not going to dwell on the plumbing. I'll maybe just make it work in the way that you expect it to work, right? Like, use our experience as a shorthand. So that's my version of yada yada, I guess.
No, I think that's a really astute answer to this. Readers, if you give readers some really good world building in an area that serves the story, what you will find is they will accept that that level of detail is there for everything else, but they will allow you to not have to put it on the page. So if you're doing a good job, Dan, one of my writing friends and partners, always says a few small details can be way more important than 7 paragraphs. If you can do this with description. If you walk in a room and rather than just giving every detail about it, if you say, this is a room where there were bullet holes in the window and the lights were flickering, you can fill in the type of room that was, right? You don't then need to go into all the depth. A few really key, powerful details can do a lot of heavy lifting. And in your world building, if you are the stuff that's important to the narrative, it makes sense and it works for the reader, you can lay these few little details that won't really be a gorilla in the phone booth because the reader's like, okay, I have enough to imagine that. I can put that to aside and I can focus on what the story's actually about. You do a lot of that. Almost everything, even Grandpa Tolkien couldn't do it all, right? And he spent 20 years on his world. You can't, and so you have to learn to yada yada.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon and Veronica. Thank you to all of you for coming.